What a strange illusion it is to suppose that beauty is goodness. Because in my experience, that's a crock of shit. And before you all go running around and calling that person a druggie, you might want to ask yourself, why are they on the shit in the first place? My life is not much different to many of you who grew up in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 1980s. Growing up a Maori girl in an all-white neighbourhood was hard going, and it only takes one person to ruin your life forever. But when multiple people do the same shit, well, that's when shit gets fucked. You have your own family and you struggle through life, and you can only pray that history doesn't repeat itself and your kids suffer the same fate. Hi, my name is Sandy, and this is my story. Growing up a Maori girl in Aotearoa, New Zealand was shit. And how you treat a child when they're growing up can have devastating implications on their adult life. Some struggle and fight to see another day, and some don't. But if I can help you get your life together, then why wouldn't I? But first we got to start from the beginning. The day I stopped giving a fuck about what other people thought of me was the day I found my happy again. I was born in Napier, New Zealand, in the region of Hawke's Bay, land of world-renowned architecture, natural devastation, the mighty dogs, and te uruweras. I belong to Ngāi Tūhoe iwi, and while I wanted to stand proud with my people, I was never allowed. The sixth in line, following 5 brothers and sisters, I was whanaued out to my auntie and uncle the day I was born. Sometimes in Maori families, the children are given to other people, usually family members, to be looked after. Sometimes it's because there are too many children, or in my case, my auntie and uncle were unable to have kids. And since there was already 6 of us, I was given to them. From that day on, my auntie and uncle became my mum and dad. Dad didn't want me growing up in the North Island because when he lived there, the cousins would call in and take all his shit while he was at work, and all his hard-earned cash literally walked out the door. And he also didn't want me growing up in the gangs, which, funny thing is, in later years the gangs would prove to be the least of my worries. And when I was 8 days old, my mum and dad bundled me up and put me in the front seat of the old Holden and drove me some 1,032.8 kilometres away to Twizel in the South Islands. Now you would think that being so little, you wouldn't remember your memories from back then. But when you had a dad who liked taking lots of photos, it was handy for when you wanted to re-jog your memory. And looking through old photos, there are times that I remember vividly, like my old cat Peppy that would sleep in the bassinet with me. Mum would freak out because she thought the cat would suffocate me, but he never did. I remember trying to put the old shapes and the old toys, and my pet deer that was taxidermied about 10 to 20 years before I was even born. Sad story, really. When Mum and Dad first got together, they lived in Tuatapere in Southland. Dad worked in the forestry and Mum worked at the local pub for Mr. and Mrs. Love. Dad's paycheck was monthly, and when they had run out of money, Dad would go out the back and shoot a deer. Because back then they were worth $700 each, and unfortunately he shot a pregnant doe. But it was never wasted, the meat was eaten, and their skins were used for mats or moccasins, and that is how they survived. Dad was gutted to see a foal inside, but he got it taxidermied, and it's that pride of joy in our lounge for years and years to come. And by the time my kids were old enough, I'd already chewed the ears off it. When I was old enough to stand on my own 2 feet, I used to pretend and ride it like a horse. And I was also fascinated by the feel of the wooden slab that it sat on. But like with many things that fell into my possession, it got fucking wrecked. It was thrown in a hole along with some other precious childhood treasures. Just one of the many regrets I had throughout my life. 1980-81, and we moved from Rover Road to Mackenzie Drive. Wasn't a bad house. I had my first kiss there with some fella named Mark. The fire brigade was across the road from us, and the marching girls would practice in the field beside it. By now the Waitaki Power Scheme was in full swing, and canals and dams throughout the region were being built. From what I can remember, Dad worked in the Ohau dams, and on his days off he liked to take me fishing in the canals. I was so petrified of that deep water that I never caught anything. And for my 3rd birthday, he bought me a fishing rod that was about 10 lengths of me long. He told Mum that one day I would grow into it. That never happened. The hoarfrosts were freezing, man. Like so cold. And I remember I used to play in it like snow. One time there must have been a huge storm and it flooded. Somewhere out the back of Twizel formed all these ponds, and on all those ponds were some swans. There were heaps of them, until one day we went back a couple of weeks later and they were gone. And what weren't gone were dead, and some filthy bastard had gone along and killed them all. But they were kind enough to leave their filthy fucking beer cans behind. Eventually the ponds dried up anyway, so there was nothing left to go back to. Another time Dad was playing on the side of the road in the ditches that had thick ice in them. When he fell through one and got all wet and I freaked out, Dad got the fright of his life and he hauled himself out of the water. When across the road a floaty plane pulled up, like it would a car. And the pilot opened up his door and yelled out to Dad, "Would you like to come for a ride?" Of course he wanted to go for a ride, but I took one look at it and thought, bugger that. I like my feet firmly on the ground, thank you. And much to Dad's disgust and his absolute probably horror, we jumped back in the car and went home. Silly old bugger, he was wet anyway, he would have got bloody pneumonia. And speaking of pneumonia, I got that a few times, coupled with its cousin bronchitis. And poor old mum, constantly unhinged trying to keep me alive, sent her into a state of depression and she had to get some help from Nana. And I spent the vast majority of my childhood in and out of the doctors and in and out of hospital. Didn't help that the next door neighbours were bullies, a whole pack of them, a sister and a brother act. And they used to push me over on the driveway or fling rubber bands in my eyes. And one time they broke one of these plastic beads off a necklace and shoved it down my ear. And that warranted a trip to Timaru Hospital where they used a massive long needle to extract it out again. I made it into a medical journal and I got a robot for being brave. 1982, and by now I'd started kindergarten, and what a shit show that was. Even then I was shit scared of people, and I spent half my life up mum's skirt hiding from the outside world. And male or female, if you had a bed, forget it. I wasn't going anywhere within half an inch of you. And when I wasn't hiding up mum's skirt, I was tucked behind the gigantic rubber tree that sat between the two chairs in the lounge. As soon as I showed interest in movies, Dad let me stay up and watch them. He'd even let me watch the Sunday night horrors, and The Exorcist was one of the first movies I'd ever seen. Mum used to tell him off because she said that wasn't good for young children, and it probably wasn't good for half the adults either. And the only two movies I was ever scared of was The Incredible Hulk and fucking Predator. I don't know what it is, but I think it was Jaws within Jaws that used to put the shits up me. But thank you, Dad, for allowing me to make up my own mind about what scared me and what didn't. Because he was right, there are worse monsters in this world than the fake shit that you see on TV. But what wasn't fake as a 3-year-old were the Maori chiefs in their tyre house that used to hang out outside my bedroom window at night time, and I don't know what they were trying to do, but they scared the living daylights out of me. And one day they left, never to be seen again, only in my thoughts, which was quickly replaced by a nightmare that I used to have of a man in a 2-storied house and his 2 dogs in a house fire. The flames were leaping out of the windows, and I'd wake up crying and covered in sweat. One night Mum woke me up and lifted me up to see out my top window, and in the distance I saw a house fire. I stopped having that nightmare after that. It would be years later that Mum told me that there was an article in the paper that said a man had been rescued by his 2 dogs, but he lost everything in that fire that night, and I realise now that it was called a premonition. And I was to have many more in the 41 years to come after that. One thing they didn't prepare me for though was bloody kindergarten. Teachers with their smiley faces coming at you, kids and their snotty noses wanting to play with you. I was so used to it just being Mum and me that that's all I wanted. I was more than happy in my own skin, just like I'm more than happy in my own skin now. But society says that we have to socialise because that's normal. And so what did I do? I hid like a little bitch under the couch, didn't I? Until Mum came and picked me up that afternoon. And that was providing she could get away in the first place. Anyways, loved art, that was cool. And playing with the magic sand was even cooler. But having to sit on Santa Claus's lap, I mean, hello, you heard me at the start of my video where I said I didn't like beds. Well, what does he have? A great big gigantic bed, doesn't he? Never mind, he came with presents, so you know, you give, you take. Loved the warm Milos for morning tea, and also the slices of fruit for afternoon tea. By 1984, I had gained a bully, And she was a rather large bully too, and unfortunately stayed with me throughout the duration of my 9 years of life. Until one day when Mum went over to visit her mum, I knew she was going to come over. I was lying on the couch eating a bag of lollies, and sure enough, the front door opened up. And it was her. And for once, I didn't want to share my lollies. I thought, bugger you, lady, and I got my first taste of being mean. I didn't really enjoy it. But she eyed up my bag of lollies and then raced over and jumped on me, pinning me down and trying to grab my wrists. My mum had spent the last 5 years trying to tell me how to deal with bullies, and that sometimes you just need to suck it up and do what they do back twice as hard. I felt the heat rise and courage overflow. I gritted my teeth, wiggled myself around so I was facing her, and laid into her. She fell off me with the first punch and landed on the ground. Anyways, long story short, I had her cornered as she was trying to get out the front door and let her have it. And then I burst into tears and apologised and said how sorry I was and that I didn't mean to hurt her. Kind of defeated the whole purpose of standing up for yourself, but like I said, I didn't feel good about it. But you know, she never touched me again after that day. And unfortunately, history repeated itself with my oldest daughter, and she had to do exactly the same thing. 100% I do not condone violence. But you know, sometimes people deserve a taste of their own medicine. And sometimes it's the only ways you can get them to stop. Anyways, speaking of lollies, would you believe I couldn't stand them when I was little? And it wasn't until Mum brought home a pack of iced animals and we made toffee apples at kindergarten that I got a taste for sugar. And at Christmas time, we used to decorate wine biscuits with icing and pebbles and have a little afternoon Christmas tea party with all the kids and their mums before kindergarten shut down for the Christmas holidays. I was given my first ever The Night Before Christmas storybook, and then I had to start school. I felt like I knew nothing when I went there. And if I thought the amount of people at kindergarten was bad, then primary school was way worse, with even more different age groups of kids. And I retreated back into myself and hid like a little bitch. I did, however, make a couple of good friends, and we always got in trouble for flinging rubbers around the room with our rulers. Well, he did. I had the collection of rubbers and he had the ruler. I learned how to folk dance and felt uncomfortable for touching anybody, let alone the opposite sex. I knew all about frostbite on the tootsies walking to school in the morning, and it's bullshit hall frosts. And every time it was cold, Mum made me wear itchy woolen tights and yucky old turtlenecks that felt like they were choking me. Corduroys and overalls were a thing. I learned how to ride a bike without trainer wheels. You know, back then things were a lot more natural. We wore real woolen jerseys and actual cotton t-shirts. The carpet in our houses were woolen. There was none of the synthetic crap that makes us all staticky and electric shocky. There's just so much that I realise now that I took for granted back then. And no longer did I get to watch play school at 2 o'clock in the afternoon because school finished at 3. I might have been lucky for the first couple of weeks and only did a half day, but the rest of it after that, I had to go to school. And that was the way life was for the next 10 years afterwards. Oh my God, and I just had a thought. Mum used to complain about the programs Dad used to subject me to. What about the ones that she made me watch? You know, the classics, The Young and the Restless, Days of Our Lives, Prisoner. That fucking program was enough to scar anybody. But to be honest, I actually still watch Days of Our Lives now, and they tell me they're up to like season 57 or something like that. It's probably more season 107. But how do they not change appearance in the 30-something, 40 years I've been watching that crap? Anyways, you know how in primary school you have show and tell? Well, one day I just decided not to show anything and just decided to tell. And I tried telling my classmates that I had 2 mums and 2 dads. And 5 brothers and sisters, and I'd never met any one of them. And you know what? They all laughed at me, including the teachers, and told me I was lying. They made me doubt myself even though I knew it to be true, because that's what Mum and Dad had always told me. And I wish I knew back then what whanau meant. But even back then, Dad told me not to worry about any of that Maori stuff, because I'd just get beaten up for it. And he was right, I didn't even need to say anything, just the colour of my skin put people off. But there was one teacher in the room next door who looked after me, and her name was Mrs. Anderson. She had a 14-year-old son, and I used to pretend he was my big brother. Not that any of the kids believed me. And what cracks me up even more is that big brother asked my dad when I was 16 years old if he could marry me. Oh, I know, 11 years later and he rocks back into my life. Crazy, eh? Thankfully, the Waitaki dams were nearing completion and it was time for Dad to find a new job. I was actually pretty pleased to get away from Twizel, because really all I learned from that place was how to be a bully or more should I say, how to be bullied, and being brown wasn't a good colour to be, and being a Maori kid whanau'd out to her whanau was lies. Social welfare at the time did their best to take me off Mum and Dad because they reckoned that they were too old. Are you fucking kidding me? 8 years later they asked them to adopt my cousin. Suppose you could say I learned about hypocrisy back then too. Anyways, it was all a really confusing time for me, and what was true wasn't, and what wasn't true was. I had to shut my mouth, forgive and forget, or have it eat me alive.